Good morning from Dovecot Studios in Edinburgh. I'm Celia Joicey, and thank you for joining the webinar. We are here on quite a grey day in Edinburgh. Happy for you to share stories of sunshine if you're somewhere a bit warmer. I attended a conference in Milan for Dovecot last week where we were sharing exhibitions with different museums and galleries from all over the continent, and it was exciting to be in sunshine there, but also be looking at some of the colour which connects with the exhibitions that the items that I'm going to show you. So knitting, I'll just give you a bit of context. So I am Celia, and the building we're in today is Dovecot Studios, which is right in the centre of Edinburgh. We're surrounded by the university, and the University of Edinburgh is now responsible for the Edinburgh College of Art. So we have got some art students who are going to be coming to the exhibition and engaging with it, which is always exciting. This is the Tapestry Studio. So knitting is one of the most fundamental textile techniques. It's produced from the continuous yarn, which usually using needles, and it is looped from that yarn to create these three-dimensional garments that you're going to see today. So the earliest examples of knitting date back to the 4th century. They tend to be from Coptic Egyptian cultures. And then predominantly the knitwear that has survived is hats, stockings, undergarments. The earliest fair isle is from the 19th century that exists in a museum collection. But what is really beautiful with knitwear is that knitted items retain a sort of an immediacy and an association with the people who have worn or created them. So I appreciate you're at a distance today, but hopefully you'll feel some of that immediacy. What we do at Dovecot, as you can see in the studios where I've sort of dropped you into, which are just next to me here, is that weaving is a completely different textile technique. You have the warp and the weft, but it's exciting for us at Dovecot to look at other media, especially in textile. So we do show paintings. We've got a wonderful Yusuf Saki show on around the balcony at the moment, but we've also got other displays coming up where we will be looking at patchwork. In the past, we've explored print, embroidery. You will see on some of the knitted garments, but that's kind of one of our sort of unique selling points, is that people come to Dovecot to connect not only with tapestry, but more generally with the media that we make tapestry with. So the exhibition is called Chanel to Westwood because it's bookended by two very strong designers, but also two very different approaches to knitwear. And it starts looking at knitwear as a very functional art form. So coming from the Scottish perspective, you've got companies such as Pringle of Scotland, who Robert Pringle set up the business in 1815. And like in England, you've got companies such as John Smedley. Knitwear begins as an undergarment. And the very first example in the exhibition, we'll drop into that in a moment, is this Edwardian underskirt that you see here. And the chevron stripes that you see will be featuring on lots of other garments. We'll be looking at some Missoni. It's a very a technique that you see consistently through the exhibition, and we've paired this with a very contemporary example from H&M that is using exactly the same knitting structure. By the start of the First World War, knitwear had started to acquire a new fashionable status. So in the early 20th century, having said that Pringle was producing undergarments, they start to attach these rather decorative lace edging, and it becomes possible to think of knitwear as something you can wear out and show on your body. So active lifestyles become more common in the 1920s as a sort of leisure pursuit, but also women play such an active role in the First World War that the clothing that had gone before, those sort of heavy, almost Victorian, but the sort of the Edwardian style, the sort of corsetry, does restrict people's ability to sort of make an active contribution to the world. And it's really Gabrielle Coco Chanel who opens her boutique in Deauville in 1913, who is such a lightning rod for the idea that women can dress both in a very stylish and chic way, using this, as Paul Poiret calls it, poverty luxe. So people are quite critical of Chanel at the time, but she comes from quite humble origins and makes that difference. And here we've got a very early Chanel garment that you'll see in the exhibition. And also we have a section that looks at les sportives. So the 1920s ushers in lots of changes, not least the jazz age, but in the lives of young men and women who are pursuing sport. And if you think about how knit can be shaped to attach to the body, knitwear is the perfect technique with which to create garments that mold themselves. So we've got some swimwear in the exhibition, but equally later on looking to both golfing, but also in particular skiing. So Chanel is this crucial figure, but there are other couturiers such as Jean Rognier and Jean Patou, who equally promote this sort of pared down couture. Chanel sort of heralds the First World War as the end of the sort of the Belle Epoque, the death of the Belle Epoque. And here you can see her looking super chic. Chanel's clothes were not cheap, but to the extent that they could be imitated and were copied by other designers, she becomes this very, very important figure. And here again is another item. We were talking earlier, we had a tour in the exhibition about fashion archives, and the Chanel work, her early work, really didn't exist in museum collections until relatively recently. It was when Diana Vreeland was curating an exhibition for the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Yves Saint Laurent in the 1970s, and they went to the Yves Saint Laurent archives and realized they really didn't have anything apart from a brown pullover. That sort of has kick-started a moment for fashion labels and brands to think about keeping an archive, just because these become their reference points for both new collections, as well as being able to tell a story about the businesses to keep existing clients kind of interested and engaged in the brand. So here we have the Duke of Windsor, later Edward VIII, and if you just look at how he is depicted here, we can see more Fair Isle sweaters in the exhibition as we go round. But he, in the 1920s and 30s, it was these aristocrats that were the sort of celebrities of their day before cinema and pop culture takes over. So weddings were highly reported in the national press, and he was a very particularly stylish figure, and he was gifted a Fair Isle. Fair Isles traditionally have to be made on the Shetland Isles, and he was gifted this pullover that he famously wore in 1922 on the golf course at St Andrews, and that kick-started an interest. The islanders produced the knitwear really as an adjunct to their core sort of industries of fishing and farming, but they were quick to increase production and diversify. So you then got Fair Isle hats and scarves and gloves as well. So we've got a few here in close-up, but we'll see that in the exhibition. So the stylish everyday knitted day dresses, sweaters, suits were stylish and sophisticated options in the 1930s. Elsa Schiaparelli, who did visit Scotland as well as Chanel, her career began with this knitted sweater with a trompe l'oeil. Anyone who is watching Question Time, I'm sure none of you are watching anything to do with politics at the moment, but on Question Time on Thursday evening, Rachel Johnson was wearing a sort of version of a Schiaparelli sweater, but it's that sort of where she had the bow that she knitted into the design. But she introduced these sort of witty touches to her knitwear and sportswear. And we see this on the far, I'm going to think whether it's hopefully it's the far right of your screen. You can see the brown and cream stripy dress with the zip. It was Schiaparelli who sort of put zips into clothing for the first time in the late 20s, early 30s. That just showed how functional and easy clothing and garments could be. We have a section on the make, do and mend, which I'll give you in more detail. This fabulous hand knitted cardigan highlights how people could have shorter ends of yarn and use them in patterns that were both colourful and decorative and quite joyous. And we have equally examples where people have sort of mixed up many more colours, such as this stripy sweater at the front. So in a period where there was less material available, the same for all clothing, there were strict regulations placed on what could be produced and what was appropriate while the war effort was underway. Knit American style. So knitwear can, as we know from Chanel, be glamorous. And in the 1940s, in America particularly, knitwear took a more glamorous turn. Hollywood stars were photographed and filmed in knitted garments. You even got certain stars being photographed undertaking knitting, both male and female film stars, while they were waiting for their kind of call. Lana Turner in particularly got called the sweater girl for her sort of rather sexy silhouette. And men's casual knitwear was also popular as shown in sort of those collegiate varsity style, but also Native American sort of knits and designs that came in. In terms of sort of folk, knit, as we know, tends to be a more Northern European sort of form of clothing, and at least originally. And so there were designers who drew on more traditional knitting styles and patterns and turned them into fashion. So motifs from Alpine regions, Scandinavia and Eastern Europe provided sources of inspiration, and continuing today, there are brands who sort of have played, especially sort of Eastern European designers, on their heritage. So you've got these fabulous examples. There are certain film stars of recent, or TV stars, so with the Scandi Noir TV series, there are various sort of detectives that have become famous for wearing the sort of more Faroe Isles or sort of the typical Nordic knitwear motifs. Having said that knitwear, you know, can be glamorous, we have some fantastic examples in the exhibition of embellished knitwear. So the cocktail hour sort of sees the introduction of the cocktail sweater. So you can see in this example here, richly beaded, decorative necklines and cuffs might be embroidered with motifs, or embellished in this case as with jewels, and worn with a sort of pencil skirt to add that particular sort of contemporary twist. Oops, sorry. Push it that way. So here on the right, you see a sweater that has got this richly sort of pink and blue and mint green embroidery across it. Crochet, we haven't really talked about. I always think crochet is a slightly more mobile form of knitting, but crochet sort of gets a bit of a renaissance in the 1960s and 70s, when I think it's that sort of homemade quality, its youthfulness, and commercial patterns become available. So the designer, we've got one in the exhibition that shows a pattern with Twiggy. There are many figures who've made their name featuring on knitwear patterns in the past, which used to sell in considerable, quantity. So as a model, you could make quite a lot more money. So we've got, you can see different types of yarn here from the 60s as well. That sort of more lurex and gold crochet. So designers such as Rudi Gernrich, who went to work for what had been a kind of underwear company that moved into sportswear, but also André Courrèges, took influence from trips to the moon, but that sort of sense of the future that fashion caught onto. Gernrich's work was particularly inspired by dance and the need for movement, but you see this sweater in the back here, which I'll show you in the exhibition, which also sort of predates with its little sort of leather belting and hooks, Vivienne Westwood, who in the 1970s and then 80s used that sort of those punk motifs in her knitwear. So novelty knitwear, we've had various press wanting to use examples of people such as Giles Brandreth, who always used to wear a sort of novelty knit in the 1980s on Countdown. But novelty knits become a feature in the 1970s, but by high-end fashion companies as well as the mass market. So here we've got the Italian Fiorucci putting in some particularly sort of creative expression. You've got some sort of applique collaging going on there, as well as the knit. Bill Gibb, so for Scotland, Bill Gibb is a very important figure who graduates and goes to study at the Royal College of Art in London. His first collection gets picked up immediately, and he wanted to draw on his Scottish heritage, but he also collaborated with other designers, one such being Kaif Fassett, who he brought to Scotland. Kaif gets inspired, he was a painter at that point, to pick up, buys these gorgeous skeins of yarn that he finds in Aberdeen and learns to knit on the train home. And Kaif and Bill between them come up with really some very romantic sort of deluxe forms of knitwear, but that also have a sort of slightly counterculture vibe to them. Here we've got a knit by Bieber, paired with a pair of Joseph trousers. So Joseph Etucci was also quite crucial in bringing in a very a more minimalist aesthetic in the 1990s, but Bieber was drawing again on that 1920s, 1930s jazz age. And to the right of the screen, we've got an example by Ray Spencer Cullen, Miss Mouse, who was drawing on sort of postmodernist trends in the more generally in design, which she brought into the knitwear. Animal Rainbow and Diana Leslie sort of pick up on that sense of 1980s excess, and under this label Animal Rainbow in the 1970s and 80s, you get these extravagant knitted pieces. Some had fur or feathers attached to them, and the styling and the detail in these pieces is particularly sought after by collectors. And then in the 80s, we've got examples here with Sonia Rykiel, but also Vivienne Westwood. So in these sort of deconstructed elements, you can see, albeit in the form of knitwear, Vivienne Westwood is pulling in the idea of the sort of straitjacket that punk played with so subversively. And we've got designers such as Julian MacDonald featured, but I'll show you these in more detail when we go round the tour. So we have tried, we originally were going to create this exhibition in 2020, and we know what happened there. But in that's given us a little bit more time to curate a series of designers who we're featuring in the Dovecot shop, but also to think about Scottish knitwear now. So I'm going to come out of this and now just drop you into the exhibition. So okay, so hopefully you can now see the Matterport, and I am going to I just have to make this full screen. There we go. Sorry about this. And so this is the exhibition. This is the sort of the doll's house view of it. And so those of you who've been to Dovecot might be familiar with our exhibition spaces, but we've got the North Gallery here, and then there's the larger South Gallery, which is where you enter into the exhibition. So we're going to, I'm just going to click as there, and we're going to go, hopefully this is going to just, it's going to make you a bit dizzy. I'm going to come back to the start of the exhibition. So we're going to run through the spaces over here. So you're getting to see it all. Close your eyes if this makes you dizzy for a moment, and then I'll get us back to the beginning of the exhibition. So when we were looking at the PowerPoint, so we've stepped into Dovecot now. When we were looking at the PowerPoint, I had pointed out this skirt, which is the Edwardian underskirt that's hand knitted, and inside, I appreciate it's always the luxury of the curator that gets to handle the clothes and see them both inside out, as well as how they then appear on the mannequin. But that does have a signature within it, which is quite special and quite rare in terms of knitted garments and talking about their survival. But we've also got these Edwardian waistcoats. So that's really just chiming in with this idea of knitwear being, and we can actually go in quite close. So this is arguably, you're seeing things more close up than one gets to when you're in the exhibition itself. So you can see these fabulous Edwardian male waistcoats. I'm assuming that's for the watch chain, isn't it? And here, as I mentioned, we've got the H&M dress that's using the same chevron knitting that the underskirt uses. So just that idea of things becoming full circle. So as we step into the exhibition, we'd mentioned those examples of Chanel and the freedom that both individuals got to enjoy after the horrors of the First World War, and the lifestyle. And this is a very, very early example of a typical Chanel cardigan. You can see on it the sort of Russian kind of motifs, or sort of certainly Eastern European, that are edged. So it's a very, very simple design, but equally it's got the knitted skirt as well as the wraparound cardigan. And it is that sort of, if I call it a three-piece suit, the cardigan, the sweater underneath, and the skirt, that really becomes Chanel's calling card in terms of what she's promoting. And even into the 1950s, after the Second World War, Chanel gets really, really cross when it's the Christian Dior sort of new look that becomes the style from 1947 onwards, because she just felt that that was going backwards in terms of putting people back into a very restrictive silhouette of having to have that tight waist. And we've got the sort of car coat here, this fabulous stripy car coat, and another example which has got the sort of the silk edging of a cardigan. So stepping over to the twin sets, we have these Chanel examples that I showed earlier with this sort of stripy chevron style. And so really using quite simple knit stitch to come up with something decorative. And you see that with other designers, even today, but particularly designers such as Missoni, who through using different yarn, but also traditional sort of chevron stripes, managed to create different silhouettes, but also a different mood later in the 1970s. Stepping just so we can see things again quite up close. I mean, anyone who knows sort of the John Smedley typical kind of British knits will be familiar with this style. And the Scottish knitwear producers are very clever in the late 40s and early 50s in terms of sort of world trade. The Far East is a sort of moment where cashmere is quite hard to get hold of. And in terms of quality, Scotland is certainly able to promote itself, the sort of the Made in Scotland label, to the American market. So that twin set that talked about from the 1950s, the Cocktail Hour and Lana Turner, Scotland becomes particularly a sort of desirable connection. And a lot of Scottish businesses, not least Pringle of Scotland, do export into that American market. But it is Chanel who's really pioneering that particular look. So here we've got some examples. I mentioned this dress, which has got the zip down the front. But we also have a hand knitted sweater here. So just showing how it was possible for people to, Chanel's knits were all done on machine knitting, but it is possible to sort of recreate that style. So again, this sort of 1930s move into clothing being both more comfortable, but equally stylish. So I'm going to jump us around the corner of the exhibition. And as you can see, we've got another section on 1920s clothing here, but also our little sporting area. Anyone who has seen the recent exhibitions looking at people like Sophie Taubert-Arp or Sonia Delaunay that have happened at the Tate more recently might like this sort of Art Deco detailing on the woven kimono. But here we've got examples of knitted swimwear and this sort of the beach outfit. So it's really only from the 1920s onward that the idea of the holiday in France, the workers are given a sort of particular moment in the late 20s where they get to officially have a workers' holiday and everybody gets the weekend. You get Le Train Bleu, which is the train that goes all the way through France, and the Ballet Russe create a production inspired by that, taking holiday makers all the way down to the south of France. And it's Chanel that gets to design the costumes for that. But if I take you back around the corner, we've got some photographs here of the people who own this whole collection of clothing. So these are images of Mark and Cleo Butterfield, but we have here, I'm not quite sure whether we can see it close enough on this, oops, sorry, on the screen. We've got a picture of Cleo's mum in her swimsuit. And the reason we've included this is because the collection isn't created by a museum, but that's the reason that it's survived. So knitwear gets worn, as we've said with the underwear, it gets often worn quite close to the body. It gets worn out, and it doesn't survive in the same way that, for example, a wedding dress might, which is worn once and then gets beautifully preserved. So museums have found it quite hard to collect knitwear because curators' responsibility is to both preserve and conserve the things in their care. So they want to acquire things when they're in a pristine quality. One of the most famous knitted pieces in the Victoria and Albert Museum is that Schiaparelli trompe-l'oeil sort of fun knitted jumper with the bow design. But it's really collectors such as Mark and Cleo, who've been so important in ensuring that certain clothes get preserved. It used to be that certainly fashion students would go into the vintage shops and pick up really quite exquisite historic pieces and then wear them out to the clubs, in which case things got really quite destroyed. So we do need to ensure that, you know, both the auction houses, antique dealers do an important role. Traditionally, working in museums, it was always a bit of an awkward thing to sort of blur the sort of the marketplace for historic objects with the sort of the sort of preservation and the interpretation that museums bring. But actually, we're reliant on, you know, people to keep things if they're going to be there for us to show, certainly in exhibitions like this. And as you can see, so this is a section with where we've got the images of Chanel wearing the knitted twin suit or this kind of longer cardigan, and they are pictures of her in the 1920s. So we've looked at sportswear. Over here you can see that Rudi Gernrich section, but now just to look at some of those joyous fair aisles, which are in very, very bright colours, aren't they? So when the sort of the Duke of Windsor wore his fair aisle and it got that attention, equally Chanel was looking to those softer colours from the natural dyes that you know, Scotland could produce. But you've got really quite sort of jazzy versions, and at the moment a lot of fashion houses are featuring Fair Isle in their contemporary collections, and it has retained something, you know, over the decades. So whether it's sort of Ralph Lauren, Missoni did their own version of the Fair Isle, but at the moment you've got brands such as Alexander McQueen, Celine have sort of got a big advertising campaign with a sort of version of the Fair Isle. And there are very different traditional knits. We've got a section here on the folk elements. As we were saying, people like Elsa Schiaparelli would play with these designs, but equally Bill Gibb was drawing on particular motifs. But these really quite sort of fun, beautiful, decorative. I'm sure that some of you who are watching are knitters and can give insights or possibly want to comment on some of these or ask questions. But really exquisite sort of examples throughout the exhibition. So just to go back into the 20s, we've got these pieces using different materials, but also picking up on some of the crazes. So if you think it's in the 20s that Tutankhamun's discovered, and you've got the Egyptian hieroglyphs inspiring particular fashion designs, you've also got here some of the sort of the Art Deco patterning coming into these gorgeous sort of scarves and knitted work, but also rayon being used to create really quite decorative, loose and sort of slinkier knits. And then if we step over here, we've got a section that similarly draws on that sort of aesthetic. And as we said, mixing, it's Diana Leslie later who puts in the sort of the fur, but here you've got a sort of mixing of materials and really designers. So you can think of designers such as Paul Poiret and Jean Paquin that come to the fore in the 1920s, along with people like Chanel. But really, this is an exciting moment for the fashion industry, the fashion world, and where people do get to be creative with what they're producing. So I'm going to go back to the make, do and mend. So here we have a section, you might remember that we showed some of these. This jumper, which wasn't on the slides that I showed you earlier, does actually have a label inside it that has the CC41, which during the war, certainly in the UK, there were limitations and restrictions. Patterns were created to help people design and make clothing appropriately, so as not to waste any yarns. But people's ingenuity and creativity in creating these 40s garments, which we can go in a little bit closer just to show you the detail, is really beautiful. Those of you who knit will know the sort of decisions that you can make and take, both interpreting a pattern, but also especially if you've got limited or particular yarns that you want to use. And this fabulous cardigan with its much more expressive decorative elements. So I'll come around. So jumping then from the 1940s into the post-war, we've got this section here just at the end of the North Gallery where you can see these cocktail knits. So you might remember I showed you this piece which has got the embroidery added to it, but equally these fabulous jumpers that have got beading and sort of jewels attached. That came back into fashion quite recently. So with this collection, we've been able to put it on open display, which is quite rare. So a lot of fashion exhibits, unless they're contemporary, have to be put behind glass, and the lighting is generally kept quite low. But we've set the clothing in a white sort of background to make it feel that little bit brighter. Just down the road from us, you have the National Museums of Scotland, which has the most incredible fashion display and textiles on the ground floor. But understandably, the lighting is very, very low to ensure the preservation of what they have on show. So it's quite rare in working with a private collection that you can put things into a much brighter and what feels like a contemporary context. So we talked also about the 19 crochet your way, and you can see that with the garments here. And you might just see where I'm just circling the knitting pattern. I'm not sure if we can get close enough, which features sort of an image of the technology for doing these matterports is very clever, but you can see the knitting pattern there. I was contacted in my previous job when I worked at the Fashion and Textile Museum by the British Library, because of course you forget that knitting patterns are part of the printed world, just like any other publication. And so clearly there are lots and lots of knitting patterns that exist in our public, but the copyright libraries. So they were sort of just thinking, I think, what to do with them. So I'm sure if you are a knitter, then that's quite a good place to go to look for some of these really interesting sort of documentation of history and how people did once much more commonly make their own clothes. But that was the suit that Cleo, who one of the owners of the collection, did create for herself with crochet from the 1960s pattern. And then we've got this fabulous section that looks at Rudi Gernrich and Courrèges. And if you think now that a lot of companies are looking to yarn innovation, there are companies that sort of brand their clothing heat tech to help keep people warm. We've also got new fibres that are being produced. People are experimenting with things like nettle fibre, but you've got other fibres such as bamboo being used for yarn. Then you can appreciate that sort of what Rudi Gernrich was looking to, and a lot of what he was producing, as we said, is interested in dance, but also in these really quite dramatic silhouettes. You can see perhaps it's sort of a bit Avengers style, some of the clothing there. So I appreciate some of you have been watching now for quite a while. So taking you now into what we call our North Gallery, and this would be normally the sort of the exit to the museum. I'll try and go a bit slowly because clever as this technology is, it does sort of jump you into various viewpoints. So here we've got the section on novelty knits, and I had the good fortune of going to look at one of the big UK art fairs, which are now back in person. So the Frieze Art Fair happens in London every October, and visiting this year you can see that everybody wants to connect with the energy and the profile of certain contemporary artists, but nothing has changed. So this jumper here that I'm circling for Ritva Man, it's a men's jumper. The emblem on it, I think it's the bird, an eagle, was designed by Elizabeth Frink, and it was a series of jumpers that were produced with the artists Alan Jones and David Hockney were included, and the company was very specific in making these works as things that you could put. So you could acquire a perspex box with which to show this jumper as an artwork. So that's from the 1970s. So the idea that you now have artists working with fashion collections is nothing new. And in fact, I worked on an exhibition about 10 years ago, but we also brought it to Scotland, to New Lanark, called Artist Textiles, which highlighted not so much in knit, but the artists who had worked in designing fabric, printed fabric, from the 1910s onwards, from Raoul Dufy through to Picasso, through to Andy Warhol. So while you're enjoying looking at this novelty section, you can see on the left the Fiorucci knits, and then I've touched on the company Missoni. So this sort of vest top, there's quite a lot of fringing at the moment going on with, I think, Prada, Joseph, and I think even some of the sort of the high street whistles have got these sort of fringed skirts. But this Missoni top, you can see, has got their typical stripes. So Missoni were a company that founded in the 1950s. Rosita Missoni and Ottavio Missoni had met at the London Olympics at the end of the 1940s, and he was a little bit of an entrepreneur. He's an artist, but he's also an entrepreneur, and he'd set himself up with a friend making and selling the tracksuits to the Italian Olympic team, knitted tracksuits. And he, in meeting Rosita, her family came from a very, very beautiful sort of business that used to produce these gorgeous embroidery yarns for decorative elements. And through their romantic association, they collaborated commercially and put these embroidery yarns onto the knitting machines. And so that was really the beginning of the Missoni look. And while they produced through from late 50s onwards, it was really in the 1970s that they moved into a more international showcase and these sort of glamorous knits. We've got a book in the exhibition. It's called Vintage Knitwear by Marnie Fogg, and it illustrates a lot of the collection that we've got on show, but it also does feature a sort of classic Missoni image on the cover. So this outfit here, I appreciate I've run out of time, is the Bill Gibb that I showed you his picture earlier. And you can see that this is a little bit counterculture. I think you get a few looks even wearing this today. But Bill Gibb was using and drawing on, as we said, other kind of knitting and pattern histories, and to create something that was, albeit designed and very exclusive to purchase, but was sort of presenting a different way of existing, certainly quite different to the Missoni look as well. So here we've got the section looking at a number of British, or British-based designers. So these are both Biba, the Barbara Hulanicki, who was drawing on those 1920s, 1930s, so this sort of sailor style pattern. Ozzie Clark, perhaps not so recognizable, but with a creative, he's revealing the shoulder. There's always conversations around fashion as to what part of the body is getting revealed or focused on at any one time. So obviously in the 1960s it becomes the leg, but here he's revealing the shoulder, which there's a bit of a moment recently where people were looking at sort of going back to exposing shoulders and backs. Here we've got, sorry, it's slightly angled, the Miss Mouse element. So this was looking to a movement called postmodernism. And in the 1980s, the Italian design group Memphis, so called because of the Memphis references in music, were created with designers such as Ettore Sottsass, but they presented themselves as a group, and they looked to inject different references to surface and to pattern, but particularly sort of those primary colours of red, blue and yellow. And Miss Mouse is sort of referencing that both in the colours of the outfit, but also in the style, and drawing on different reference points. I'm going to move over to this section. So we touched on the Vivienne Westwood knits. So it's quite common in fashion. So I'm going to go, see if we get a better angle now. So it's quite common in development of sort of fashion that you have individuals who will help to come up with, I guess, what you would call the prototype in engineering that then gets developed. So whether that's in making a toile, but in knitwear, there are certain individuals, and both Vivienne Westwood can knit. There's pictures of her knitting backstage at some of her fashion shows, but she was really being quite inventive with this jumper here. So you can see that this is from the Seditionaries period. So in the late 70s, Malcolm McLaren collaborated with Vivienne Westwood, and they were part of that punk movement. But Westwood later sort of wants to sort of distance herself from that, and you get the Pirate collection, but also the sort of the Buffalo Girls collection, where you're drawing on different reference points. Zandra Rhodes, so we've got this long knitted piece at the back, but also we've got that referencing of Rei Kawakubo for Comme des Garçons. So there's a moment in the 1980s when both Japanese designers but also Belgian designers start to sort of deconstruct fashion. So putting artificially sort of putting holes into clothing, but also putting sleeves in the wrong way round, mixing up fabrics. And so really this part of the exhibition is to sort of look at that inventiveness. And that leads to a section here on Julian MacDonald. So MacDonald, you might know, he appeared on Strictly Come Dancing, which is quite fun, but he's actually very clever and a very serious designer. So we've got examples of his work all the way through this section. Now, machine knitting is a very different process to hand knitting, and quite often designers who get as far as sort of studying at postgraduate. So MacDonald is from Wales, but he later went to study knitwear at Brighton, and he studied under Sandy Black, who is the UK's best known and most brilliant sort of expert on knitwear in fashion. She's a mathematician who became a knitwear designer, but then really important figure in design education and making Brighton really a very important centre. So in Scotland, we've got excellent colleges of art. For knitwear, probably one of the best known would be in Hawick. But you can also study knit at most of the colleges, but it's a very different process doing it by machine. So you can see these sort of spider-like, really inventive use of shape, bodycon, but also it's incredibly sort of almost ethereal, the knits that MacDonald was creating. And he had very high profile fashion shows throughout the 1990s that allowed for him to have that profile, but to be celebrated when people have got that sort of both ingenuity technically, as much as in being able to sort of express an idea on paper or on computer. So here we've got those animal rainbow knits, and again you can see the sort of the playing with the silhouette. Sometimes in fashion history it's thought that there can be an impact when there's a television series that has high viewers, or a film that can have an influence on people looking back. So certainly if you sort of think of sort of Twiggy and the Boyfriend film in the 1960s inspiring that sort of reflection back to the sort of 1920s, you do get those sort of jumping around. And then towards the end of the exhibition, conscious you've all been watching for ages, which is very impressive, we have a section that starts to look at some of the Scottish knitwear. So this looks particularly at the work of a designer, Di Gilpin, and here a section on a company called La Fetiche. So La Fetiche is based in Glasgow, April Crichton, and her contemporary who now lives in Paris, but they both worked for Sonia Rykiel. So Sonia Rykiel was famous in the 60s for the poor boy sweater, so that sort of idea, almost like a beatnik style pullover, worn typically by, you know, kind of classic French pop singers. But Sonia Rykiel also introduced quite glamorous knits in the 1980s, and arguably she is responsible for the sort of those batwing sweaters that came into fashion. So La Fetiche come from that heritage of colour, and they've been developing work with Di Gilpin that draws on very traditional sort of, they produce these pieces in very low quantity. They are expensive, so some of their jumpers can range from anything from sort of 250 to £1,500. But in a way, if you do hand knit, that is important to recognise the work that goes into it, but also the yarn. So yarn is not inexpensive. There are less expensive versions, but if you work with the longest fibres and the highest quality yarn, then that is not, that's kind of core part of the cost of any item, let alone the time and the love that goes into making something. So we hope that with this exhibition, people will both be inspired to get their knitwear out, but to also think a little bit differently about what they buy, how it's made, and hopefully to get inspired to do some knitting themselves. So I'm going to ask if anybody's got any questions to pop them in the Q&A. And then it was just to sort of give you a little bit of an insight into, so this, we have a shop that's through those doors in the foyer, but we've been promoting a number of contemporary Scottish makers too. So here we've got Di Gilpin's work, we've got Jennifer Kent, and we've also got Todd and Duncan. In the shop, we've also got yarn from Wool and the Gang, who are a British duo. I think one of them worked for Stella McCartney doing knit. And I think the other one might have been with Marnie, but they set up their business over 10 years ago, and they've been quite pioneering in sort of presenting knitting as a very cool thing. More recently, we've got people like Tom Daly, who has, from a more sort of perhaps amateur perspective, picked up knitting and promoted it in a very lovable way during lockdown. And I think that's what we feel is important at Dovecot, that we make artwork here in the studios. And so a lot of our visitors are interested in that process of making, but also in being able to sometimes be a little bit acquisitive. So I'm just going to look in the Q&A to see if anybody has popped in any questions. So I can't see any questions. So unless anybody has got anything, so somebody's asked for any reading suggestions. So there is Sandy Black. I'm not sure if her book is still in print, but the wonderful world of the internet means that you can now get books that have that are secondhand from, you know, various websites. So Sandy Black, I would recommend as being an expert on knitwear in fashion. She had a Thames and Hudson book, but she's also produced a knitwear history at the Victoria and Albert Museum. There is the Marnie Fogg vintage knitwear book. It's got a sort of lilac cover, but it was previously published in another format with, probably got a copy here. It's got a slightly more glamorous, it has a forward, maybe I'm not sure if anybody can see that from the camera. It's got that cover on it, but it has a vintage, it's got a sort of purpley lilac cover now. So I would recommend those as really good, inspiring sort of ways into both the history of vintage knitwear, but also knitwear in fashion. And then of course, technically, there are a whole host of books about how to knit, but the wonders of the internet is that YouTube is, you can pause things, you can get various patterns, and there are certainly networks such as Ravelry. But if you are a knitter, we'd really love if you could sort of share the fact that we've got the exhibition on, because I'm sure for those of you who make, part of the joy is getting to come and see things in more detail, and to turn it into a bit of an event more generally. So I'm just going to look at more questions. So someone's just asking about who were the last knitwear images that we showed in the exhibition. So I'm not sure whether you're talking about, in terms of the images, the work by Diane Leslie, Animal Rainbow, and how are their names spelt? So I'm not quite sure who you were mentioning, who's asked about the knitwear images. So if you type there. So someone's asked about industrial knitting machines, and certainly really it is at the sort of the turn of the 19th and 20th century that sort of those machines get used. Today, there are still very, very clever people coming up with new knitting machines. Certainly Turkey has been a centre of production for a long time, but of course the Far East, China is an amazing centre. I had hosted a talk with one of the European directors of Uniqlo, which is a Japanese company, and they were fascinating about how they were developing their production presently, looking to both older production lines in Japan and bringing people back who'd long since retired, but also a lot of that sort of knitwear machine technology was invented on the continent around sort of the turn of the century, and it still comes from that sort of that underwear. Rainier was one of the makers, and that's who Chanel worked with her factory. So people have said, can we see more of the Vivienne Westwood piece that's on the poster? So the poster for the exhibition actually has a Chanel composite, one of the posters that was created for an exhibition called Harris to Paris, which was a promotional exhibition that the Scottish government worked on a number of years ago. And then I am just thinking, so I think the other one that's on the poster is this, not sure if everybody can see the fact that I've got the question and answers up. So is this piece by Lafetiche, that they collaborated with Di Gilpin to create. So that's there with the sort of version of a kilt there. Just going to look. So someone's talking about the undergarment at the start was very bright. Would that only be seen by servants' partners? I guess I don't know really. But being in that red, so there are certain dyes that, and again, Scotland, part of the quality and the success of the Scottish export market, both today but also after the Second World War, was about the quality of colour, and ensuring that things were dyed to such a rich extent. And I think those sort of turkey red dyes were more commonly available. So the fact that it's a red undergarment, but I can't claim any expertise in that, but certainly red was perhaps a more common dye stuff, so it was more easily available to be able to knit in red yarn. So I think that is most. Oh, so somebody's asked, how long is the exhibition on for? So we're open at Dovecot from Monday to Saturday. Sometimes if we've got events, we do things on a Sunday. Oops, not sure what's coming up there. And the exhibition is open from 10 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock from Monday to Saturday. But we do occasionally have evening tours. And if you wanted to bring a group, we're more than happy to arrange a sort of tour in person with either me or the curator on site. We can also give tours of the tapestry studio. So we welcome you. We're going to be closed for about 3 days over Christmas, because I think Christmas falls on a Saturday. So from the sort of the Friday, Saturday, Sunday over the Christmas period and on New Year's Day. But otherwise the exhibition is open until the 11th of March. And after that, those of you that are fans of knitting, we're doing a show with Kay Fassett. We're going to bring up the exhibition that's currently on in London, and that's a quilting and patchwork exhibition. So not Kay's knitwear, but hopefully he will come up and give a talk while the exhibition is on. And then next summer, we're going to be working with Scottish women artists, and we'll have more tapestry on show. We've got various talks coming up. We've got a talk with Helen Wilde, who is the curator of historic textiles at the National Museum of Scotland, and she's just written a book about the tapestries of the National Trust of England, not National Trust of Scotland. So we're going to be launching that with her with a fantastic talk on the 1st of November. And then we've got various workshops if you're interested to come and visit Edinburgh and either do a weaving workshop. We've got one happening today in our ladies' baths. And we can also facilitate those. So thank you all for watching. Thank you for your support, because just by joining this tour, you help to keep Dovecot on the road. And if you're interested in any of the other things that we're doing, then yeah, please get in touch. I'm going to escape. Oh, the colourful ones. So Caroline was asking about which these clothes. So I'm going to go in, Caroline, so that you can see how Lafetiche is spelt on the website there. So Lafetiche is a brand from all good retailers, but I know that they were selling some of their work through, they have their own website actually. You're best to look them up. They sell their garments directly. And so this was really part of being able to sort of show a Scottish designer, but also one that's working at a sort of high fashion level with their knitwear. But there are some fantastic collaborations on the high street at the moment if you're keen to be acquisitive, having been inspired by this morning's talk. So thank you again for attending, and hopefully get to meet some of you in person if you're visiting Dovecot. We're quite a small team, so you're welcome to say hello, and yeah, have a great day. Thank you very much.